Okay, I think we are live now. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a fresh episode of lecture series on Center for Historical and Literary Research, New Delhi. We have successfully completed 5 episodes, and this is our 6th one. We aim to transcribe these lectures and publish them as articles in the face of a book. We have many more interesting lectures lined up. Please stay tuned. Today, we have with us a very special guest, Dr. Shilpi Rajpal. She did her undergraduation from Sri Venkateswara College, Delhi University. Her MA, MPhil, and PhD were from Department of History, Delhi University. She has had her association with Aysar Mohali, Jamia Millia Islamia University, New Delhi, and now she is placed at University of Copenhagen, Denmark. Welcome to CHLR, ma'am.
Opportunity to speak. I'm really thankful to CHLR for this for offering us this platform to discuss our work, and I'm going to today discuss about my book particularly. I'm going to discuss through this book my journey of being a historian, and I'm going to elaborate this fascinating area of research which I have spent almost a decade working on. Just to show everyone and share with you. So this is the book which I wrote, and it came out in 2020. Um, to start with, I would first like to refer to this quotation, which says, "Let us run away to Lahore or Dhaka, since they are foreign countries now, but there are asylums there too." It was Asar ul Haq Majaz. It was Majaz, the poet, who saw Qazi Nazrul Islam in the Ranchi mental hospital. On seeing him, he said to to Qazi, who was one of the revolutionary poets of the time, who was in the mental hospital because he was suffering from a neurological disorder. He said, "चलो यहाँ से भाग चलते हैं, लाहौर चलते हैं या ढाका चलते हैं." And फिर वो रुक जाते हैं और बोलते हैं, "मगर पागल खाने तो वहाँ भी है, but asylums are there too, so there is no escape." To go back to this point, I will rather like to point out how uh, histories of asylum or histories of psychiatry are connected to the history of colonialism. It was the colonial state which uh, which led to the which which established number of asylum throughout India. Different point of time, they differed from being in terms of number, from being 28 to to 25 at different points, but it was as early as 1740s that a mental hospital was opened for for soldiers particularly, and soldiers, especially for European soldiers. These asylums were open to fetter or to put behind the European soldiers because it was believed that they should not tarnish the image of the Raj because they were white and should not be insane on the streets of different towns, of different presidencies. The white has to be sane and orderly in order to control and rule. This was the primary motive of the opening of the mental hospital. And throughout the history, even till the 1920s and 30s, there were separate asylums for European and natives in India. And what is also very interesting and fascinating is that as early as 1800, if we go back, the asylums were extended to the natives, to the Indians, because to somewhere there was this idea of street clearing, to idea of uh, providing these asylums, providing space to these people who were considered as dangerous and curable. But we will see as I discuss entire policy being formed over this period. The policy of lunacy, the policy of managing these lunatic asylums, and the word lunacy comes from the word lunar, which means moon. It was believed that it was the influence of the moon on the insane, the waning, and the way moon can control the tides, and the way moon controls the insane and in their temperament in certain ways. So this idea was very much prevalent. Though different terms were used in different periods of time, you have terms like insane asylum, you have insane hospital, you have things like mental hospital, which were being used. So it is different period that different terms were being used. Also, at this point, I would like to refer to that in terms of history writing or historiography, there are very few works which are being done, in terms of history of madness or history of psychiatry in India. The few works are of Walter Dunst, whose earliest work was called The Mad Tales from the Raj, which also looked at the European insane in colonial India, the menace or the problem which the European insane were believed to be. The European insane were believed to be highly problematic in certain ways. They were believed to be um, to be constantly, who had to be repatriated back, who had to be sent back every very regularly in order to manage and control the, you know, the very idea of lunacy at that moment of the time. But we also have fascinating work by James H. Mills, which also spoke about in his work called Madness, Cannabis, and Colonialism, about the link between hemp and insanity. How hemp as a drug was regarded, particularly in Indian subcontinent, causing insanity among the patients. So, hemp as a drug was regarded as something which was creating delinquency, and I'll come more to the word delinquency as I discuss. But at this point, as I also want to share my journey of writing on this very interesting topic, not only my PhD, but also converting into this book over the period of time, is also how to write about this history of psychiatry, how to write about the history of madness. What were these sources? How did I try, how did I trace them back? What were the repositories I visited? Because in the very idea of historian's craft and the idea of becoming a historian, we often need to learn, and which is something which is so crucial for someone who comes from places like India and South Asia, to know about sources, because unlike the Western countries, sources are not always available at a click away. They're in these dusty libraries. They are in these rural areas, which where they are far from organized. You have to fight your way in. You have to get to them, and this was also my struggle while writing about these histories of psychiatry. During my PhD and also after my PhD, before publishing this book, I I went to Agra, Banaras, Bareilly, Lucknow, uh, Amritsar, Chandigarh, and also Lahore. Eventually, which I was not able to do before doing that, and not only trying to tell you about these geographical regions, but also trying to explain you about the number of libraries which I came across, then how I was able to collect these sources from working in the Hindi, like the Hindi Nagari Pracharni Sabha in Banaras, to the mental hospital in the Agra like to in the Agra mental hospital, where I was able to find number of case histories which were lost in terms of not being in archives. They never reached archives. So it's also something which it is very unlikely in a lot of other contexts where these case histories or case registers were there in these hospitals, but the doctors or the people were themselves not aware of it. And how difficult what was it for me to get access to these sources, and how actually histories are there in these sources, in these sources about, the case studies of these patients. Who are these patients, their socioeconomic background. Some of them have fascinating stories to tell, and stories in the sense of telling you about the psychiatric tales, the psychiatric afterlives of people, psychiatric lives of the people in the mental hospitals, and how they lived through it, what made their everyday, what was their quotidian lives like. So these are all the things which we need to, in certain ways, understand. We need to, figure out when and how, as historians, we learn the craft. So, also talking about this, and as I discuss it further, in terms of sources, my work looks at number of government policies, legal processes. By legal processes, I also mean number of papers of the acts which were passed at different points of time. To name a few: 1858 Act, which was the Lunatic Asylum Act, and also the 1912 Act, which also was another remarkable act which was passed in the colonial period. So I I very carefully went through the documents, the debates, the discussions about the governmental policies. And by policies, I mean the various policies in terms of shifting timeline from the bigger 19th century, the 20th century. So my work looks from, like, tries to trace the history from 1800 to 1947, which is also a huge period in terms of history writing. It's a period which was difficult to cover in certain sense, and it also is based on case histories of number of patients, which um, which I found in different mental hospitals, to how psychiatry penetrated itself into the vernacular languages, how what uh, what were the discourses about madness, how madness was understood, let's say, in the Hindi medical literature. In if I'm and at this moment, uh, what comes to my mind is also the period which I will discuss very soon, was also the 20s and 30s. So all these sources coming from different places, not only the National Archives of India or the Murthy Library or the British Library, London, or the Wellcome Library, but also uh, the Hindi Nagari Pracharni Sabha, the Agra Mental Hospital. All of that allowed me to write in detail uh, histories of insanity, histories of madness. And when I say and try to use the word histories, because there's no one story, there are a number of stories which my work tries to elaborate. It's trajectory of also a psychiatrist, but also of the patient, also of the mad doctor, but also of people, and also the thin line between them, which also talks about at different points of time, because psychiatry still remains to be one of the most difficult of diseases to pin down, to comprehend. So who were these mad doctors? How did they professionalize themselves? Who were these patients? This is something which my work has tried to do. Now, to just give you a very quick overview of the 19th century, the primary idea behind the treatment of insanity was that of the moral management. The idea of moral management was, in some ways, very simple and yet complicated. But to treat the insane with kindness and with certain routine. So routine became a part of their idea of curing insanity. This idea has been also heavily criticized and dealt with in detail by Michel Foucault, where he discusses how guilt was used to trap the madness, how madness gets medicalized during the period. And this is absolutely right, that this is the phase of medicalization where by there is also, which historians of South Asia, and particularly Nile Green, has also talked about the street clearing venture. Now, by street clearing, we mean the certain sections of the society which were seen and it's very problematic, which were like that of like the fakirs, the hemp users, the prostitutes. So unlike the asylums in the West, where there were more and more people who came from the middle class, here it was always the police who will pick the vagrants, the problematic section of the society from the street, and send them in front of the magistrate, who, with the help of a medical doctor, would, in certain ways, declare the person insane. My work has clearly elaborated one of the central arguments, which I pointed out, that how bad it was prioritized over the mad. And what I mean here is that there was a constant emphasis on that uh, only the curables um, and the dangerous should be brought into the asylum. It should not be the incurables and the harmless, because the asylums were very limited in India. There was very limited budget. They worked on bare minimum. These people had to work in these mental hospitals. Something very interesting which comes to my mind is also at this point how certain paisa was eventually given, 2 paisa or something, to the hardworking and well-behaved lunatics, how lunatics were paid amount if they worked in the asylum, how work became a yardstick of the cure. So how cure was so essentially based on work in this way, and how these asylums were manned by these patients. So there was this always, other than the Victorian asylums, which were luxury, where the rich and the rich could come and stay. In the context of India, they almost had a correct of four houses. Um, I'm talking about the 19th century, and particularly talking about curables. So curables were the people who would who would be cured and they could send them back, which was a certain ratio of people. The dangerous were the ones actually who manned the asylums, because they had to be dealt with. But at the same time, I'm trying to also point out how we should refrain from using that it could be used as a disciplinary tool against the native population, because they were very limited. They never had the infrastructure, uh, the finances to bring more and more people inside it. But they still were part of the correctional, penal order of the colonial empires, and we cannot deny, and historians of psychiatry has spoken at length about the power of psychiatry in terms of colonies, in terms of the role they played. What also we see here particularly, and something which becomes a very interesting link from the 19th to the 20th century, is by the turn of the 20th century, there was a commission, a Indian Hemp Drug Commission, which probed into the links between between the insanity and use of hemp in India. Now, by the use of hemp, I mean the use of cannabis. So it was believed that more and more cannabis was causing insanity, and it was something which was a cause of worry. So there was entire uh, Indian Hemp Drug Commission also inquired about other moral causes, and where it's grown, who are the sections which uses it. So it was an elaborate inquiry, but one part of the inquiry investigated the links between hemp and insanity. But by the end of it, it was clearly denied that there are clear links between it. But what was pointed out was the faulty character of the lunatic asylum. So it was actually, the entire direction was shifted from the hemp, because hemp was also generating revenue for the Britishers. So they wanted to not problematize hemp as such, but rather they wanted to shift the focus to reforming the mental hospitals. So by the wake of the 20th century, because this is happening in the 1894, you will see that these smaller asylums were amalgamated and made into the larger asylum. The idea was to make them, which could be used as clinical spaces. But unlike the West, again in India, they become rather these huge asylums where there were lack of any infrastructure, and the scientific inquiry or the scientific study, which was the idea behind it, really did not flourish. To give you example, the Delhi asylum was closed down and Lahore was made into a central asylum for Punjab. Then again, Lucknow was shut down, and Agra was made into the central asylum for the Uttar Pradesh. So this shift in terms of reorganization and reform became a turn of a century movement, because for the first time, now you do not only have the surgeons, like earlier it will be the surgeon who will go from a place to place, like a surgeon general who will take care of the lock hospital, the jail hospital, the mental hospital. But now there was a full time, for the first time, there was a full time psychiatrist, or psychiatrist is still not the right word, but a full time superintendent who was there in this asylum, which will have around up to 2,000 patients. Where earlier you had 200, 400, smaller asylum, number of small asylums, so now they were centralized as such. What happens as not a very direct consequence of it over the next 20, 30 years, these voices of the psychiatrists are able to be heard. And in some ways, drug commission is this beginning of this change, is the it's a marker of this shift in certain ways, where psychiatrists try to reify their identity. Psychiatrists try to consolidate their identity. And you see psychiatry as a discipline starts developing in India. And also at the same point, you see psychoanalysis also coming in India, and psychoanalysis also allowing Indian psychiatrists, Indian psychologists to form in other spaces. So this, if you look at the 20th century, the beginning of 20th century, and this was also one of my struggle, that there was no work on the 20th century. Whether it is work of Walter Ernst or James H. Mills or Devjani Das, they have all looked at the 19th century. So I was actually piecemealing together archive after archive, making sense of the 20th century. What happens in the 20th century? Whereas these psychiatrists are coming, psychoanalysis is becoming one of the tools of psychiatry. It is a part of um, it is the part of new mind sciences which is emerging in this period. You also see mental hygiene movement, which was a movement which started in US by this patient who tried to commit suicide in order to reform psychiatry or mental hygiene. And I have got into elsewhere into great discussion about it. But mental hygiene movement is also where they promote the mental how to how daily aspects of life would actually allow someone to develop good mental health, promote mental health of the people. To this got linked the idea of the child guidance, the child through the child welfare, however the child psychiatry in certain ways also starts emerging. By child guidance, there is a links to the family psychiatry, to the child psychiatry. So it starts penetrating down into different ways. Psychiatry becomes a all in one force. And this has to be investigated. This is again a new um, new area of study which I can see there is a lot of scope in, and which I'm also looking at it at this moment. but to point out how psychoanalysis and mental hygiene becomes important part of the new repertoire of psychiatry, new part of the structure, how psychology flourishes. These are all disciplines which are happening in this moment of time. What is also very important in this period of time is also to look at certain, if you look at the 1920s and 30s, there is shift in terms of from the asylum is becoming these small from becoming the places of the vagrants to or the prostitutes or the hemp users and particularly also the fakirs, because fakirs were also one of these hemp users, which were targeted. But by the 20th century and by the 1920s and 30s, there is more and more middle class who is also getting informed about the the science of psychiatry. So you see number of people coming from the middle classes who are actually now ready to pay for the mental hospitals. So you have number of you have, like, in my case, my chapter of the case study I found out this boy who's in love with a radio singer. So how his family actually uses mental hospital. He wants to marry Kamla Jharia, who probably had a status of being the superstar of the time, and how he sent to the mental hospital for a few months. In order to correct him. So how correctional facilities were also used by the middle class families. How state is also how there are also khilafat workers who are in these mental hospitals. So 20th century also unearths this fascinating histories of the communal movements, the movements in the sense of the nationalist movements, and why I'm talking about like how this Khilafat worker wants to actually kill all the Congresses. So there is this, the larger nationalism does penetrate down into the mental hospital. And once again, we should think about here Sadat Hassan Manto, and how Manto's story about overtaxing, makes you think about this man who is insane but who is more sane, who actually questions. Um, this, and something which I will also like to elaborate at this moment is also something which I've really found fascinating, and which becomes very important in this period of time. Psychiatry as a discipline, as a medical science, starts penetrating also into the vernacular languages. More and more people, more and more magazines are talking about hysteria, they're talking about swapna dosh, they're talking about hasme, they're talking about uh, masturbation and how it's causing insanity. So these ideas found within the larger discourses of Hindi public sphere at this moment. And why what I'm talking about by the Hindi public sphere is also, this is again a time of readjusting the gendered ideas, readjusting the ideas of femininity, readjusting the ideas of patriarchy, readjusting the ideas of communal spaces in terms of Hindu and Muslim, where there is constant fear of Muslim reproducing more. You can clearly see that how through the use of these texts, it's how the loss of semen, the fear of the loss of semen becomes so central to this, to the psychiatric discourses of the time, especially which penetrate into the vernacular languages. Um,
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was actually something that hit us as a nostalgia as your students. Thank you so much for taking this lecture. We shall host you once again very soon. Thank you.